WandaVision is one of my favorite Marvel properties ever. It feels so different from any of the Marvel movies, and it shook up the formula in a way that made me excited for the future of the MCU in a way that I have never been before. And so that's why it kind of pains me to say that I have pretty mixed feelings about the finale. It wasn't bad, it just didn't connect with me on a way that almost every other episode did. Now, this is not a train wreck of a finale by any means. This is not a Game of Thrones Lost, How I Met Your Mother level of bad. No, it doesn't become convoluted or undo character development. It's just disappointing. And so, I want to use this time to explore why I loved WandaVision, my problems with it, and my feelings about the finale. But first, let's talk about the MCU. WandaVision is the first Marvel original series to premiere on Disney+. It is not their first overall, however. There were several Marvel series centered around the Defenders that premiered on Netflix, and I want to talk about those for a minute. Daredevil was the first show premiere. After the 2003 film of the same name suffered massive box office and critical failure, this was a risk. It was also a huge departure from the cultivated tone of the MCU set by Joss Whedon, the villain of our tale. While all MCU movies have character development and human drama, Daredevil focused on it. It made Matt Murdock the center of attention, not Daredevil. Daredevil was quickly followed by Jessica Jones and Luke Cage, and all three series received immense success and acclaim, with many citing the performances, writing, and themes. Notice here that it's the writing that receives the acclaim. While all MCU movies are entertaining, well acted, and well produced, they're not generally known for their writing quality. That's not to say some of them aren't well written, but it's not what they're known for. These shows prove that Marvel was capable of making well-written human dramas that departed from the tone of the MCU. So what did they do? They released Iron Fist and The Defenders, which took this risk way too far and ended up making it such a slog to get through either of them. Actually, The Defenders wasn't that bad. Sigourney Weaver made a great villain, but to try to take all these shows that are based around character development and very grounded human themes and to glean an Avengers-esque product out of them, it kind of betrays the tone of the whole project. This will become important later on. So why am I talking about the Defenders in this video about WandaVision? Well, I want to establish the creativity that Marvel is capable of and how it was almost destroyed by Joss Whedon. In 2012, the film The Avengers was released and it became an instant commercial smash. It is still one of the highest grossing movies of all time. It received immense critical acclaim, and it's considered one of the defining movies of the 2010s. It was directed by Joss Whedon, the king of nerd media and basically confirmed abuser. So quick tangent. As I've been writing this, the allegations against Joss Whedon have been piling up, and I want to put in my 2 cents. Abuse for the sake of art is still abuse. If you have to abuse your cast, your crew, in order to get your perfect shot or whatever, that's still abuse. And it not only makes you a horrible person, it kind of makes you a horrible director, if we're being honest. So that's my take. Back to the point. Joss Whedon is behind such classics as Buffy the Vampire Slayer, its spin-off Angel, Firefly, Dollhouse, The Cabin in the Woods, etc. He's developed a cult following for his dark humor and quippy dialogue, and he also completely ruined the MCU. That's a bit hyperbolic, but listen, Joss Whedon is a talented writer. I mean, he's a talented writer according to nerds, unlike myself. But Joss Whedon is a very specific type of writer. His style is definable, particular, and recognizable. You hear Joss Whedon dialogue and you know that it is Joss Whedon dialogue. And that has mixed results overall, to say the least. While I would say the style mostly worked for the Avengers, it did something hugely consequential for the entire MCU. Because of how financially successful the Avengers was, it set the precedent, it set the tone for every Marvel movie to come. Joss Whedon's writing style boils down to dark storylines with quippy dialogue. It's more complex than that, don't come for me nerds. Or do, that's your choice. But that's the template. So again, because of how financially successful the Avengers was, Kevin Feige, the primary producer for the MCU, tried to replicate that style for all the other Marvel movies. The problem was, Joss Whedon didn't write or direct most of the Marvel movies. He only did it for the Avengers and Avengers Age of Ultron. So you have these people trying to replicate his style without his input or direction. And so you know what happens when you try to replicate someone's style? That's right, you get sent to the naughty chair. It's just that the end result comes off as unoriginal and tacky. But I mean, Avengers Age of Ultron felt that way too, and Joss Whedon actually wrote and directed that, so what do I know? Now, this is not to say that some of the films didn't work. Captain America the Winter Soldier, for instance, took a more gritty tone and political angle for its movie and ended up being one of the standouts of the entire saga. I just called the MCU a saga. God, I still have Twilight on the brain. But ultimately, this decision caused all the movies to blend together. All the movies are, of course, unique in their own ways, but the end result of all this comes off as redundant. Because of Kevin Feige, and I'm blaming a lot of this on Kevin Feige, but it was a group effort, MCU movies have gotten less original. Thus, Disney movies have gotten less original. And another thus, big budget movies as a whole have gotten less original. Hollywood as a business is about creativity and artistry only to a certain extent. Ultimately, people are in this business to make money. And that's fine, there's nothing wrong with making money, except unless you're hoarding it, but that's a whole other thing. And movies need to make a profit if we are to get more movies. And filmmaking is a risky business. People pitch movies to studios, they give an estimated budget, and they just kind of have to hope that they're accepted. There's other factors, going over budget, certain things falling through, messy contracts, etc., etc. And then another problem comes with the fact that nobody can quite predict exactly how a movie will do. You can have studio backing, an established fan base, all the marketing in the world, a solid director and cast, all of that, and a film can still not do as well as you think. That's just kind of how it is. So what are studios to do? They could attempt to take risks and make movies not based on existing material. Or they could do the safe maneuver and make movies with established fan bases so that they know to a certain extent that the film will be successful. So this is where we finally get to WandaVision. So what does all of this nonsense have to do with WandaVision? Well, I'll tell you. Oh, hi, welcome back. Now, there is not necessarily anything wrong with simple plot lines or filmmaking. I mean, the general audience doesn't generally have the patience for Charlie Kaufman or David Lynch. I mean, even I have problems with their filmmaking style. And I pride myself on being someone who spends a lot of time studying cinema. As a result, I'm also super pretentious. And I mean, look at Tenet. That movie was super complex and nobody liked it. One thing I was taught in my one screenwriting class, so I'm reputable, is that stories should be simple, characters should be complex. Blockbuster filmmaking can never really be too experimental or it will alienate its audience. That is a creative restriction that big budget filmmaking has to deal with. However, there is a limit to how simple something can be before it becomes boring. As I said, the MCU movies tend to blend together, and pile that on top of the oversaturation of Marvel, Disney, and overall superhero movies, and it becomes a lot. I mean, for a while there, it seemed like there was a new superhero movie coming out every single month, and people got sick of it, and Marvel got backlash. Not enough backlash, I guess, because they still made the highest grossing movie of all time, despite it not even being close to their best work, but I digress. WandaVision is a 2021 series produced by Marvel Studios, and the premiere episode was released on January 15th, 2021 as a Disney Plus exclusive. The show centers around the characters of Wanda Maximoff and Vision as they hop between different sitcom eras and tropes while the mystery of why they're there looms in the background. From this point on, there will be spoilers, so if you haven't watched the whole thing, you might want to back out now. WandaVision is the exact breath of fresh air that Marvel needed. It feels almost nothing like any other MCU project until the end, but we'll get to that. But it feels like that because of its unique setting, the different filmmaking choices, the nuanced dialogue, and the dark storylines. This is the project of a company who knows they can't fail, and that has some implications that I'm not going to dive into. But nevertheless, Marvel knew that this would succeed no matter how crazy it was. Jack Schaefer and Matt Shakman, the creator and director of the show respectively, took two of the most underdeveloped and underutilized characters in the entire MCU and made them into two of the most developed characters in the entire canon. And they did this in about 3 episodes. They eschewed the Marvel filmmaking style in favor of doing whatever the hell they wanted. And there's something amazing about seeing a filmmaker doing whatever the hell they want. It's liberating and fascinating to watch. Even if the end result is mediocre, you can tell they put their heart and soul into this, and it makes it better than the sum of its parts. Remember this, children, that'll be important later on. Because of the restrictions of the Marvel formula, even the best movies like Black Panther and Thor Ragnarok have scenes and moments where they feel very Marvel-y. WandaVision is the least Marvel-y project that the MCU has ever done, but it's also not immune from its pull, and I will get to that later. Elizabeth Olsen is an amazing actress, and WandaVision finally gives her something to do. In particular, her performance in Breaking the Fourth Wall, where she is emulating Julie Bowen from Modern Family, shows her skill at impersonation. Elizabeth Olsen is given a huge challenge with this role, in that she has to act in these different sitcom and generational styles while retaining the heart of her character and still being relatable and accessible to a modern audience. That is a lot to put in one performance, and Elizabeth Olsen somehow nails it. And while she did her part in other Marvel movies, there was a real struggle to nail her personality or character. In this scene alone, WandaVision does more to develop Wanda's personality than 4 feature-length movies before this did. They also brought back her Sokovian accent, which mysteriously disappeared in Infinity War, so good on them. She is protective, emotional, and nurturing, but she is also manipulative, impulsive, and hypocritical. WandaVision succeeds in making Wanda an actual relatable character with flaws, despite the fact that she's playing pretend most of the time. And Elizabeth Olsen is so good that she gives the line "No" so much weight and intensity. And through her character, Marvel accomplishes something they have never done before: moral ambiguity. In most popular long-running TV shows or movie series, there's a concept of the big bad, which is just the villain for that season or movie or whatever. Thanos is the big bad of the MCU up until Endgame, for instance. The point is, every Marvel movie has a villain. Even Civil War, which pulled most of its drama from the conflict between 2 groups of heroes, it still had Zemo to instigate the conflict, and so it still had a villain. He's mostly arbitrary, but that's not the point here, kiddos. Now, having a villain is not a bad thing. It is a effective and efficient way to instigate conflict. The problem with Disney and Marvel is the over-reliance on villains. WandaVision doesn't really have a villain for the first 6 3/4 episodes, and the closest we get is Wanda, our hero, our protagonist. Now, it is not unheard of to have your main character be the villain in a story. Protagonist and hero are not synonyms. But making our main character, the one we're rooting for, the one we relate to, the villain of the story, brings up moral questions that Marvel has never dared to ask before. Like, how does grief affect those around us? How much can we justify our actions based on our mental state? Have we, the audience, ever been guilty of similar things? So, Wanda, in just a few short episodes, cumulatively shorter than most MCU movies, becomes one of the most, if not the most, developed character in the entire series. Paul Bettany is a veteran actor by this point, but most people don't really know that much about him. His most well-known roles were Gangster Number 1, A Knight's Tale, and Master and Commander. Like Wanda, nobody really knew what to do with Vision's character, and so he was relegated to a glorified bit role that didn't show any of Bettany's range or talent. WandaVision finally gives him something to do, and finally gives Paul Bettany the chance to show how talented he is. Contrasted with most of the characters in the MCU, Vision has a very soft and understated personality. He rarely gets too upset or raises his voice, but that does not mean that he doesn't have conviction. He sells each and every one of his lines and flips between sitcom eras with the same adeptness as everybody else in the cast. Now, this show doesn't do as much with Vision as it does with Wanda. This show is centered around Wanda, so that makes sense. but it still does give Vision a definable personality that has been absent from previous Marvel movies. He is gentle, witty, and brave, but he is also somewhat naive and a little too trusting of Wanda. It's also fascinating to watch a character who has been defined by their intelligence fumble with and struggle with his responsibilities as a father and a husband. Through Vision, this show shows a level of intimacy and trust that has never been established in the MCU before. Vision is completely devoted to making sure that Wanda stays happy. I really like this Gizmodo article about it.
Vision has been similarly aware that something's up, but rather than the compelling undercurrent of dread that's been growing stronger around Wanda, WandaVision's given him an almost laser-like focus on his duty of being an idealized provider.
The article goes on to talk about how even when Vision knows or suspects that something's wrong, he is completely devoted to making sure that Wanda stays happy. In the first episode, Wanda is the one to question the reality, and Vision is the one to justify it, to comfort her, and to reassure her that this is their life. Now, there have been romantic interests and kissing scenes in the MCU before, I know, gross, but never with this level of conviction. None of it has ever felt real until now. There's also the type of masculinity that Vision represents, where he is strong for his family, but he shows a more vulnerable side frequently and makes sure he lets Wanda know how much he loves her any chance he gets, and it's really refreshing to see in big budget movies like this. Kathryn Hahn has become somewhat of an internet darling lately for her versatility, charisma, talent, and personality. She has been playing supporting roles for years and years, and she is one of the most interesting character actors working today. And while Elizabeth Olsen, Paul Bettany, and the rest of the cast do very well with their flips between sitcom eras, Kathryn Hahn is the only one here who absolutely feels like she belongs in every era. Whether it's her scene-stealing performance in the pilot, or her scene with Vision in the Halloween episode, or her transition from supporting character to villain in the Modern Family episode. It's been Agatha all along. She sells every second of it. Beneath the pastiche and veneer, though, there is a dark side to her performance. Once you know the twist, you analyze her nosiness, intrusion, and annoying neighborly behavior as insidious. Her performance is consistently funny and charming, but it is never one note. And the final twist works due to the writing, yes, but also because of Kathryn Hahn, and I don't think anybody else could have sold this performance quite like she did. Teyonah Parris as Monica Rambeau only has to put on the sitcom performance for a couple episodes, but in that time, she has one of the most fun scenes in the entire show. When she is outside of the Hex, she is shown to be a very capable and resilient woman, but there's also this sadness beneath her performance due to her missing her mother's death. And so now she is struggling to become someone that her mother would be proud of. It's a great combination of toughness and vulnerability, and Teyonah Parris plays this with a very nuanced performance that I really want to compare to Allison Janney's in I, Tonya. Bear with me. The reason Allison Janney's performance in that movie was so acclaimed and won an Oscar was because there was never a moment where she cried or showed a more vulnerable side, but yet every single line she delivered had a sadness behind it that most audiences probably wouldn't see too much unless they look closely. And while Monica Rambeau is not mean or catty like Allison Janney in that movie, she does have a hesitancy to show too much emotion. But again, she carries this sadness from missing her mother's death. And all of this culminates in the scene where she powers her way through the Hex and becomes a hero, not through divine intervention or scientific experimentation, but through grit, strength, and compassion. And Teyonah Parris sells every second of it. And she is also, without question, the most developed Black woman in the entire MCU. WandaVision takes some of the most underdeveloped characters in the entire MCU and in very little time fleshes them out to be some of the most complex and relatable characters in the Marvel series ever. That is absolutely incredible and absolutely nothing to scoff at. WandaVision is always changing how we view the show, and it keeps the show dynamic. Very few episodes look exactly alike in terms of camera quality, color scheme, or aspect ratio, and it all feels intentional. It feels like these choices reveal something about Wanda or another character or the world, and that is hard to do. For example, in episode 3, near the end of the episode, the world changes from black and white to color. And while it serves to mesh this episode with the next one, it also serves as a turning point in the narrative. And this might be me reaching. But after this point, the sitcom veneer starts to falter more dramatically. It's almost as if Wanda's happiness is tied to viewing the world in a simpler way, or in black and white. Yeah, I'm gonna retract that. In episode 7, a mockumentary style is used, obviously emulating Modern Family. However, near the end of the episode, something happens. During a talking heads section, the interviewer, later revealed to be Agatha, asks Wanda if she feels like she deserves her world falling apart.
Do you think maybe this is what you deserve?
What?
This immediately unsettles Wanda and probably the audience due to the fact that we weren't expecting that. And it used the medium of film and the tactic of breaking the fourth wall to do that. So it conveyed a feeling in a unique way that can only be done on film. That is good filmmaking. So much is told through visuals alone. In a movie series plagued by expository dialogue, visual storytelling is really refreshing to see in this. The shots of people either frozen in place or repeating minute actions because of Wanda's influence provide some of the most haunting visuals that this show or the MCU has had. And it also serves to show just how much damage Wanda has caused. There's also experimentation with the tone in the commercials. Now, the commercials tend to be much darker than the episodes they appear in, whether it is a toaster emulating the bomb that fell into Wanda and Pietro's apartment in their childhood, or a child literally starving to death. They are also, at least to me, very darkly funny in a way that Marvel has very rarely attempted and barely ever succeeded at. And I still don't know if I was supposed to laugh at them. And I think that's kind of incredible. Other than Thor Ragnarok, no MCU project has made me laugh like WandaVision did with those commercials. They also serve to remind the audience of Wanda's tragic life before episode 8 lays it all out. This is doing two things at once and is also good setup and payoff that is unique to the medium of film. There's so much good filmmaking here, and these interesting filmmaking choices are usually done with the purpose of paying homage to sitcoms past. And it's the nature of those homages that I want to talk about. WandaVision pays homage to many sitcoms, including but not limited to The Dick Van Dyke Show, Bewitched, The Brady Bunch, Family Ties, Malcolm in the Middle, and Modern Family. WandaVision is built around the concept of these two characters basically playing house in these different sitcom tropes. So the homage is not subtle. Almost every episode has this facade of a sitcom that hides the real plot behind it. At some point in every episode, the sitcom facade fades to show something sinister. Now, tonal shifts are one of the hardest filmmaking techniques to pull off, because there is not really a hard and fast rule as to how to do it. If you do it right, it can add intrigue and layers to your story and keep it fresh, but if you do it wrong, it can disorient the viewer and cause dissonance. The main way to pull this off is through foreshadowing. Establish that this tonal shift is coming subtly enough that the viewer won't quite notice it, but obvious enough that their subconscious will. As a whole, WandaVision pulls off these tonal shifts absolutely fantastically. If you go back and watch it, you can find dark implications hidden behind simple lines. I think what makes these tonal shifts next level, though, is the way they critique the idea of the sitcom itself. Art is inherently political, though there may not be any intention for it to be. Art will always make a political statement, no matter how hard it tries to remain neutral. Sitcoms may not seem like it at first, but they are intensely political without meaning to be. Classic sitcoms adhere to the American ideal of a white-passing mom and dad with a couple kids and a dog living in suburbia with a bunch of other people who look exactly like them. To say that this image is politically neutral is ignorant. Sitcoms set up the ideal of what the American experience was, and that ideal was something most Americans couldn't achieve simply because of how they were born. WandaVision presents the image of two white, yes, Vision is a robot, that's without race, but Paul Bettany is white, so it's the same principle, heterosexual, upper middle class, attractive people living the dream in suburbia. While the main narrative is about the processing of grief and denial, which we will get to, there is a subtle commentary on the way we view the American dream. Wanda escapes into this fantasy world of living in sitcoms to escape the fact that she lost two of the most important people in her life, her brother and her love. She thinks that playing this role will provide her relief, which, it does for a little while. I Love Lucy was one of the first sitcoms, having released in 1951, and is probably the most influential. As a result, sitcoms are indebted to the style and aesthetic of the 1950s, the era where everything seemed to be on the up and up. There are exceptions, of course, but I'm making an overlong pretentious think piece about this. Leave me alone, Mom. What WandaVision does when these tonal shifts happen, though, is that it breaks down this ideal image that sitcoms present us with. Wanda views these sitcoms as the life she wanted, but because of the sitcom's limited scope, she can never understand what life in these eras would have been like. My point here is that WandaVision builds up these sitcom tropes and aesthetics only to break them down, and in the process, shows the shortcomings of the idealization of them and what they display. WandaVision strikes this perfect balance between its love for TV past and its critique. The show is almost writers encouraging TV to be better, and that's kind of amazing. WandaVision uses its inherently wacky premise to poke holes in the idea of sitcom perfection. Wanda's attempts to hide from her real life by living in a sitcom prove fruitless because her grief always comes back to the surface. Grief is bizarre. It's kind of hard to define grief because it manifests in so many different ways. The base definition is that it's a response to loss, particularly of a loved one. But even with that, more questions come up. What kind of response is it? Is the response I'm having healthy? Why is Toni Collette yelling at me? Everybody responds to loss differently. People will lash out, become depressed, try to ignore it, drink, try to laugh about it, etc. Some of these responses are perfectly natural, becoming angry, sad, or numb. But then there's the people who sink into depression, alcoholism, etc. And I'm not a psychologist, but I'm gonna go out on a limb here and say that's not very healthy. But I'm not here to offer you questionable free therapy considering I got a C in my one psych class. I'm here to talk about WandaVision. It's clear throughout the entire show that Wanda is grieving. I mean, she says this in Endgame.
You took everything from me.
Wanda never really had the chance to grieve before now. Her brother, the one person who's been beside her for years, the only person she could rely on, died in a really stupid way, but that's not the point. And then the next movie, she seems to have forgotten about him. They almost never mention Pietro after that moment. And then immediately after Vision died, she was blipped out of existence, so she never had the chance to process that. And then she fought in a gigantic war. And WandaVision is only like a couple weeks after the events of Endgame. And so this is all fresh. And I mean, at the end of Endgame, we have this big important funeral for Iron Man, and Vision gets nothing. And Wanda's left alone to deal with that. They even addressed that in the show, that Vision never got a funeral. WandaVision finally offers Wanda the chance to process her grief. And it's made clear in the show that she is processing her grief poorly by trying to suppress it and ignore it. I want to call attention to Endgame for a moment. So in that movie, Thor is traumatized because of his encounter with Thanos because he feels he could have stopped the blip, but he failed. And instead of doing something interesting like exploring survivor's guilt, they turned Thor into a fatty McFatterson and played all of his panic attacks and anxiety and trauma for laughs. This is probably one of the most egregious parts of Endgame because it takes too much light of a very serious issue. WandaVision finally takes grief and trauma seriously. In episode 8 previously on, it is revealed that when Wanda was a child growing up in war-torn Sokovia, she would use sitcoms, particularly the Dick Van Dyke Show, as a way to escape and also to learn English. And it was also during a viewing of the Dick Van Dyke Show that a bomb fell into their apartment and killed both of her parents. So she has a lot of emotions tied to sitcoms. The point is, while I've been analyzing how WandaVision critiques Marvel and sitcoms, the explicit theme of WandaVision is about grief and about how ignoring or suppressing your grief will ultimately lead to more harm. The infamous line in episode 8. So, The line in this episode when Vision and Wanda are sitting on the bed and he says,
"But what is grief, if not love persevering?"
is a perfect encapsulation of the themes of the show and a very emotional moment, and it did make me cry the first time I watched it. And before anybody says anything, it was a good line. Twitter just overhyped it and turned it into a meme. Like, it does everything. And it creates one of the most emotional scenes in the entire show. In fact, WandaVision is the first Marvel property to make me cry. You know, when Iron Man died in Endgame, it was sad, yeah, but I didn't really have any emotional connection to him. And this was after years and years and many, many movies of developing his character and making sure the audience related to him. And I'm sure it worked for some people. I'm not judging anybody for crying at Iron Man's death. I just didn't. The reason it made me cry is that it absolutely took the time to personalize Wanda, to show what she had experienced, and to show how horrible she was feeling and how horrible she was treated, so that we know that this was her breaking point, and we know that she has lost everything. And now I understand why losing Vision and then subsequently seeing him disassembled and violated hurt so much. WandaVision also shows how grief doesn't just affect the person who lost something, it can affect those around them as well. Wanda kidnapping an entire town and forcing them to live this sitcom life was a very interesting and frankly brilliant choice, because there was no ill will on her part. She didn't want them to feel pain. In fact, she says that she thought they were happy. But because she refuses to process her grief, she puts an entire town through hell just so she can feel better. And you know, it can be a lot to watch somebody go through the grieving process, because there's only so much you can do. You can try to guide them, you can try to help them, but it's ultimately up to them. So making this concept almost literal added layers to the theme and made it a more emotionally complex show. It shows sympathy for Wanda's situation, but it also doesn't excuse her for her actions. You know, loss is one of the worst things you can experience, but it's also one of the most universal. Mortality is something that we all have to accept at some point, so we are all going to grieve at some point in our life. As Vision said, grief is love persevering. So there is some beauty in that. Sup? My neighbors finally stopped playing house music, so now I can do this. It is time to discuss the bad things about WandaVision. As we've discussed, the MCU has gone redundant. They have a formula. They blend together. But you know, we've already talked about this. Why am I bringing it up again? Well, despite what I have said about WandaVision feeling so different than every other Marvel movie, there are moments and even episodes that feel like Joss Whedon reaching his grubby little hands into the project and making it worse. And I hate that. You know, despite the fantastic performances from Teyonah Parris, Kat Dennings, and Randall Park, there's not really much they could have done to save the scenes outside of the Hex from feeling just like every other MCU project. You know, the glossy camera work, the neutral color scheme, the triumphant music, it all just feels like another Captain America movie. Episode 4. Sorry, this notification won't leave my screen. What the hell, man? I need a new goddamn computer. Okay, whatever. You know, but I need the... Okay, now I can scroll down like that. Cool. Okay. Let's get back to it. So, episode 4. Episode 4 does prove to be a showcase for Teyonah Parris' talent, but it also serves to introduce us to the absolute worst character in the entire show, white guy side villain. Wanda, Vision, Monica, and Agatha are the 4 central characters of the show, and everybody else is either comic relief, tragic victims, or Wanda's children. Mostly. And then there's white guy side villain. What are his motivations? What is his purpose? Like, he provides a little bit of conflict for Monica so that she feels more motivation to help Wanda. But I personally thought that her missing her mother's death was enough to do that. What does he do? Like, the most impactful thing he does is show WandaVision's corpse and then blame her for stealing the corpse. But he did not need to be an ongoing, recurring character in this show. He's also just annoying. He doesn't even get a satisfying comeuppance after lying, cheating, disrespecting his colleagues, going against protocol, attempting murder on Wanda and her children. He gets trapped in his truck and arrested. Is that satisfying to you? Because it wasn't satisfying to me. I feel like a woman after having sex with a random man. Or me after having sex with a random man. That's inappropriate. Monica should have torn him a new one. But, you know, PG-13, I guess. Agatha is underdeveloped. Catherine Hahn's fantastic performance basically distracted us from the fact that she's evil for the sake of being evil. She's power hungry. And at this point, that is such a cliche. And I feel like there were so many missed opportunities, which I've listed a few. One, and I don't really like this one as well because it's a little bit trite, but have one of Wanda's victims be someone Agatha knows and loves. Now, this doesn't really work that well because Agatha is a loner. She doesn't really keep that much company. 2, there could have been a scene where we are seeing the true power of the Scarlet Witch and why it terrifies Agatha so that she has more motivation to stop it. 3, she could have gotten to know and like Wanda and become sort of a bitter mentor figure to her. And to me, it doesn't really matter whether this mentoring is for good or evil. 4, she could have had a near-death experience that her own magic couldn't fix, and so she needs the power of the Scarlet Witch to make sure that doesn't happen again. None of these ideas are perfect. I'm not a seasoned writer or anything, but I feel like they could have been at least a little bit marginally better than what we got with Agatha, which is a really underdeveloped character. And that's a shame because this is such a character-driven show. And then we have the military. Luckily, the inclusion of the military is kept to mostly one scene in one episode, but it's still weird to me. In this scene, the music, the dialogue, and the framing makes it all feel like this is some triumphant reveal that Monica's contacts were her old military buddies, and I just don't buy it. Yeah, they gave her a tool that she thought she needed but didn't really end up needing, and then they disappear into the night. They weren't even in the finale. Like, what was that about? Marvel has always been military propaganda. You know, the Department of Defense has collaborated with Marvel on several movies, including all the Iron Man movies, Captain America, Winter Soldier, and Captain Marvel. There is this undercurrent of basically praising the military and the troops in the MCU. I'm not really going to dive into the implications here because I have made a video on it, and if you want to watch it, you can, but it's not good, so please don't. The introduction of Evan Peters as Quicksilver led to massive speculation that mutants would be brought into the MCU because Disney had just acquired Fox because they can't stop eating until they've achieved an entertainment monopoly. But that's not the point of this video. Many people thought this casting was evidence of a multiverse possibly created by Wanda in her grief. And then he was revealed to be a nobody possessed by Agatha, and they made a boner joke. It was all stunt casting, and while I'm personally very for not giving the fans what they want, this one felt very mean-spirited. They cast Evan Peters knowing that it would cause chatter, and then they did nothing with it, and I think that was a missed opportunity. You know, it's really a waste of Evan Peters' talent in the character of Quicksilver. Discuss my major problems with it. There are more. I'm not gonna say that these are the only problems with it. But we need to get to the finale. Oh yeah, finale's up next, so y'all get to see my pie and how I completely flubbed the ending that I couldn't redo because it involved cutting the pie. Okay, bye. Finales are hard. Tying up every loose end and creating compelling story is tricky, but even trickier when you have as many eyes on you as Marvel does. The other problem with Marvel is now there has to be time devoted to setting up future movies and projects, which limits what the creators and directors of these movies and TV shows can do. WandaVision is a mystery, a romance, and a character study, and I loved it for that specific reason. It felt intimate and personal, but also universal. But because this is Marvel, we of course have to have a huge fight scene at the end. This is tricky though, because the fight scenes are very unique to this show. There's mental and emotional manipulation, impossible choices, philosophy, strategy, and minimal choreography. The finale uses planting and payoff with Wanda's use of the runes on Agatha, something established in the previous episode. It's also a smarter and more strategic fight scene than I've seen in previous Marvel projects. It subverts expectations when we think Wanda is going to defeat Agatha in her mind, a callback to Age of Ultron, and then Agatha turns it on her and gets the upper hand. The defeat of Agatha by trapping her in the persona of Agnes is a morally dubious decision that I want to compare to Avatar: The Last Airbender's finale. Catherine Hahn's performance in the scene is also absolutely incredible. She has the same intonation and demeanor as Agnes, but there's none of the joy or the humor behind it. It's really unsettling to watch. Vision's use of the ship of Theseus allegory is the first time I've seen philosophy discussed in the MCU. And it creates a really powerful scene, and it's a very smart scene. And then Vision recalling his old memories to defeat White Vision is a very affecting way to end it. The thing is, this finale is smart, and I admire a lot of things about it. So why did it feel lackluster? I think it's similar to the problem I have with Black Panther. Both of these projects boast some of the most emotionally grounded and mature storylines in the entire MCU. And there's clearly this desire to make something creative and unique, but because of the restrictions placed upon them by Disney and Marvel, they have to balance the story they're trying to tell with the studios telling them what to do. I think it's even more frustrating with WandaVision because of the sheer amount that they try to stray from the Marvel formula and how much it worked when it did. Because it's when the MCU formula creeps back in that the story becomes awkward, to say the least. WandaVision did not need an epic fight scene to end this show. This was not what the show was leading towards. The scene near the end where Wanda gets rid of the Hex and has to say goodbye to her children and Vision is a really emotionally powerful scene. It allows for two incredible performances from Olsen and Bettany. It shows Wanda's growth, it brings the theme of grief to a head, and it ends the show on a very bittersweet note. This was what the finale should have been about. There shouldn't have been fight scenes, flying through the air, or soldiers. But you might be asking, if there are no fight scenes, how do Agatha and White Vision fit into it? Well, first of all, White Vision is a fairly weak character, and is clearly just set up for future projects, so I dismiss him. But then Agatha, on the other hand, is a strong presence and integral to the plot of the show, so she can't exactly be written out. But I think her best scene in the finale is when she releases the citizens of Westview from Wanda's spell. She forces Wanda to choose to save these citizens of Westview or keep her family. This is a really hard choice, and that is the purpose of a villain. It also takes the theme of grief affecting others and makes it explicit. And it shows Wanda the sheer damage she has caused. It's also just an unsettling scene and a very clever move from Agatha. When this show is clever, it works really, really well. But the finale had so many parts that just weren't clever. Remember in Captain Marvel, when Carol breaks free from her control by the Kree by sheer force of will? Why wasn't there a scene between Agatha and Wanda akin to that? And that's when the true power of the Scarlet Witch could have been shown. Not after a lengthy physical fight, but after a psychological battle of the wits. And then this is more of a personal preference. The way the show was written, it could have gone either way, but I want to see Wanda become a villain. She has the perfect makings of a villain origin story, and she would have been the most developed villain in the entire canon. If she were now to become the big bad of the MCU, it would have made it more interesting by default. Her transformation into a villain wouldn't have seemed forced either, unlike some shows. She's already kidnapped an entire town and controlled its inhabitants. It's not far-fetched to say she would keep going. Her motivations would also be understandable. She wants her kids back, and she is going to do anything to get them back. This is a more personal and understandable reason to become a villain. And then with the Scarlet Witch power, she would have been even more powerful than Thanos. She is more personally relatable and also more physically powerful than the previous big bad. She would have made an amazing villain. And who knows, maybe she will become the villain later, but I want to see her become the villain now. Maybe I'm impatient. But the ending just felt too wrapped up given all the damage she had caused. And then there's the little things, like how Monica's big hero moment was to save Wanda's children from being shot by Hayward. On one hand, this shows her selflessness and bravery, but on the other hand, it gives her very little agency. Basically, every other character, even Darcy and Jimmy, do something where they actively try to take down the villains. But Monica just ends up being a shield. The thing is, when the finale gets back to the psychological battle between Wanda and Agatha, it shines. The emotional scenes also really work because of how much time we've had to develop these characters. I can't say exactly what should have been done to fix it, but I do know that this could have been a masterpiece if it didn't have to use all these Marvel-shaped cookie cutters. But even if diverting from the Marvel formula would have made it worse, I honestly would have preferred it because it would have felt like a director's singular vision rather than a studio checking boxes. Regardless about my mixed feelings about the finale, WandaVision marks an important first step in the creative direction of Marvel. It shows that something so different from the formula can still succeed and thrive. This is still Disney, so it won't release the big budget film industry from its chokehold. It will hopefully encourage future creators and filmmakers to be more creative with how they approach their projects. You know, if we are going to live in a Disney monopoly, we might as well have some good movies. Hopefully that'll distract us from the chrome perfect life that Disney is trying to sell us. Now, I guess we just gotta wait and see.